Hello guys, today's video is going to be a post builder review of my latest creation here. As a post builder review, this is a kit review where I've actually already built the thing, so we can look at more than just how nice the parts look in the box on the sprue. We can actually talk about any fit issues, corrections I've made, modifications, errors in the instructions, and any other problems like that. So it should be a little bit more worthwhile if you're one of the 3 people in the world who cares about modern Chinese armor. Alright, so quickly, what the heck is this thing? This is a modification I've made of the Hobbyboss ZSD-89 APC kit. I've modified it to be a semi-fictional vehicle, which I'm going to call a ZBD-89, which would be the designation for it if it existed. ZBD being an IFV, while a ZSD is an APC, essentially. And originally, I bought this kit. I was going to do an Ethiopian vehicle because they have some cool camouflages. However, doing some research on modern Chinese armor, which is not easy by the way, there's not much information on these guys, I quickly realized that there's multiple different versions of the ZSD-89. And actually Hobbyboss makes a second kit which they call a ZSD-90, which is actually still a ZSD-89 in reality, which is essentially the same kit with some different hatch arrangement, different turret, different number of pistol ports on the side, and so on. And there's further different versions of this, and one of those is the Ethiopian one, which is not available in any kit. I'd have to modify this and essentially scratch build a turret, which I am not skilled enough to do. So instead, I found interesting photos of a YW301, which is basically this on a Type 85 chassis. However, I've done it on a Type 89 chassis, which is a slight improvement of the Type 85 with different tracks and different engine, and that's pretty much it, to be honest. So like I said, semi-fictional, but based on reality, we'll say. Let's get into the build now. So basically, the first thing I did was I had to do some surgery on the base kit to move hatches around and plug some pistol ports, essentially to create the hull and turret configuration that I wanted. What I learned is that a razor saw like this that you usually use for cutting the molding blocks off of resin parts is actually very useful for precisely cutting out panels that you actually want to reuse. This is a good way to precisely and cleanly cut at those panels. Saved me a lot of time when it came to filling some of those parts because it was a lot cleaner work. In addition, there's a bunch of huge locating holes and also gaps on the hull because there's oversized holes for all the big plastic tool clamps and the plastic options for the mounts for the lights and the marker lights on the front and rear. And also there's a grenade launching thing on both sides that I left off. Even if you're doing the plastic options for most of those, I think you're going to have to do some work on those huge slots because they're really, really big. And also there's fit issues where there's big gaps where the hull front meets the roof and the sides there. Huge gaps, pain in the butt. I had to do 3 layers of putty and sanding, and then I hit it with primer. There was still a lot of work to be done, so I did 3 to 4 more layers of Tamiya putty and sanding and primer, and more putty and sanding. And eventually I got it to basically a flat plate, which is how the kit probably should be given to you. At that point, I was able to then mount all the finer details, which as you can see are not primed because I left them off. They would have been damaged, broken, in the way during all that work. Those finer details are things like all the hatches, which are fine. There's a little bit of finicky mold lines on the little handles. But overall, it's pretty straightforward and not very complicated. And there's also, of course, the photo etch options for the light mounts, which I recommend. They look much better than plastic ones. Very easy to work with, very simple folding. I added some conduit lines to them, mainly because there are some molded on ones for the rear lights here, the marker lights, but they were sanded off during all my putty work. So I added them with 15 thou styrene tube, and then also some 10 thou for the smaller conduits to the individual marker lights. Additionally, I re-added welds that were lost during my sanding in a few areas. To do these welds, I did not do them by hand. Instead, I used the Archer resin weld decals, I'm not sure if these are still available, but if you can find them on eBay or something, I highly recommend them. I know you can do the welds by hand, but the issue is if I do a few select welds by hand, I have to do all the welds. I have to replace the ones that weren't damaged because the ones I do by hand are going to look so much better than the surviving molded ones. If I use these weld decals, they look pretty good. They're not amazing, but they perfectly match the level of detail of molded welds. So I can leave the welds that are surviving and then just add a few where I need to, because this kit is not worth doing all the welds over by hand. You'll note that I left off the headlights. I'm going to leave them separate for painting and add them on at the end. The kit does not give you clear lenses though. You have these solid molded parts. Again, this kit's pretty basic for the most part. Luckily, my buddy Paul has 3D printed some clear lenses that are the right size, so I will use those and it will look much, much better. For these photo etch vents over the engine here, these are not very easy to work with because they're very, very thick photo etch, and they have you essentially curving them, rolling it instead of just bending it along what is essentially like a mesh. And if you've ever tried to do that, it'll just try to kink because it's really hard to get very, very fine details to roll nicely. They just want to bend because they're quite fragile. So I had to actually anneal this multiple times. You might be able to see the discoloration, but essentially using a lighter, soften it up, and then roll it a little bit with a brass tube, soften it again, and just keep going back and forth and very, very carefully, slowly building up that curve you need to match the profile. And it worked, but that's pretty tricky. And this is one area where you don't have a plastic option if you're trying to do this as a beginner. There were for all these other brackets here, but there's no plastic option for these. I also dealt with the tools at this point. Panzermeister moment. I added 3D printed tool clamps. And you might be asking, who the heck makes modern Chinese 3D printed tool clamps? Well, Eduard does by accident. Essentially, Eduard makes a set of German 3D printed tool clamps, which are not the right shape. I can demonstrate here with the Adam Man 3D printed tool clamp. It's a different variant, but it serves the purpose. Essentially, these are tension clamps. So they snap shut, and that's what holds the tool in place. So this has to be down for it to actually work. The Eduard clamps are kind of like this, which it doesn't really hold very stable there because it's like at the peak of the, that tension. But if you look at the modern Chinese clamps, they have a much steeper angle of the handles, so when they're latched shut, they actually look a little bit more like this. So the Eduard misshapen clamps look like that, and they match modern Chinese tool clamps. Yeah, so I actually bought the misshapen Eduard clamps just for this vehicle, and I replaced the terrible molded on tool blobs on the handles, and you'll note that I actually replaced some of the handles just so I can skip sanding up seam lines and stuff. Let's wrap up with the suspension. Another example of the dichotomy of very simple and then also kind of complicated, because there's photo etch brackets for the bump stops for the swing arms, and again there's no plastic option when there was for a bunch of the other photo etch in the kit. In addition, the tracks in the kit are individual link plastic tracks on sprues. I'm not exactly complaining about that because personally I'm a fan. If you've built a Trumpeter BMP1, you're familiar with these. Essentially, once you clean them off the sprue and everything, you've got little nubs and little holes, so the tracks pop together and they're workable and they stay together pretty well. A lot of work goes into the tracks on this kit, and if you're a beginner again, that's going to drive you to insanity. Additionally, there's rubber pads on the tracks. As you can see, there's 2 rubber pads on the inner face, and there's 1 rubber pad on the outer face. There aren't rubber parts in the kit. I've actually painted that by hand, and I've pre-painted the lower hull because I have to mask it off to paint the camo on the upper areas. So this took 8.5 hours to paint the rubber pads on the tracks in this kit, which was a lot of fun, let's just say. I better earn some Chinese social credit score for all the work I put in those track links. And then after I put together the suspension, which was very, very basic apart from the photo etch brackets and the tracks, of course, then I put on the side skirts, And then I've actually added a little strip styrene bracket along the top here because it should be there, but it's not present in the kit. And that's pretty much the kit. It's very basic in most regards, and there's a bunch of weird complicated things, and I also did my own modifications to it, which made it more complicated. Very quickly, the turret I've put on here is a modified Trumpeter BMP-1 turret. This is representing a WZ501 turret, I believe. Basically, I've taken the kit turret, modified the Sager launch rail. It's different in Chinese, but whatever. It's a Militka knockoff. That's evergreen H-channel styrene extrusion with some holes drilled and then some conduit wires added there. I added the weld decals and also some tie downs from spare T34 fender tie downs just to match reference photos. So that's about it. Hopefully this video was entertaining somewhat. I mean, like I said at the beginning, nobody cares about modern Chinese vehicles, and there's no aftermarket for this kit because no one cares about it. But maybe you guys enjoyed it, maybe like listening to me talk about my projects, and it's kind of a cool vehicle, basically a knockoff BMP-1. And I'm going to have a lot of fun painting and weathering this because I'm going to do a crazy marine digital camouflage pattern that I've seen in some photos. That's why we have blue and green going on here with the lower hull, as you can see. So this kit, the Hobbyboss ZSD-89, is honestly not a good kit. I would not really recommend it unless you really want to build it for some reason. But I wouldn't say pick it up if you see it for a good price because it's too basic to be interesting to advanced modelers, and there's too many weird complexities and frustrating assemblies to be attractive to a beginner modeler. If you enjoyed, you can support me on Patreon. It's much appreciated, and the Patreon guys really help me making these videos and buying paints and products to show on this channel. As always, if you have any questions or comments, post them on below, and I will see you guys next time, most likely painting a digital camouflage on this vehicle. Until then, stay safe, happy modeling. See ya.